All right, welcome everyone to Unsafe Space Book Club. I am your co-host Carter Laren, and I am joined by Carrie Smith and a whole bunch of other book club members. Howdy, everyone. Let me make sure I've got everyone here and everyone can hear me and can speak. Carrie, can you speak? Is everyone working?
Hello, Carter. I'm just
I hear
trying
you.
to,
Okay, good.
for anyone who is looking for the video, if you want to see the chat while we're talking, I had to do a search for Unsafe Space Human Diversity to find it because it wasn't showing up on the channel, but you can find it there.
Yeah, there's been some weird YouTube things, but it is on the community page of the YouTube and all that. But if you're listening to this, you already know where it is. So
yeah,
all good. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining. Tamara gets the official prize today, as the I think she's the only person who has been to all the book clubs now.
Woohoo, Tamara!
Yeah. So welcome, Tamara, and maybe because it's been you, Tamara, who wins the trophy. Maybe you should kick us off. What do you think about this book?
I compared it to the bell curve, which I had read as well. And he has very vague assertions that are thoroughly backed in science. He reserves making judgments. But he's still going to get attacked as quote unquote hate facts because there are issues. There were a few points that I did not 100% agree with him. I think one of them that I brought up to the group was, we don't have really the full data on the impact of environment versus genetics on IQ, because there are a lot of correlations between poverty and low intelligence. But when you're in the developing world, a couple of bouts with malaria can cause brain damage. Malnutrition is almost as bad as not getting, as starvation. Parasitic worm infections reduce your intelligence. And one of the things I quoted in the group was how a worm gave the south a bad name. And we had a direct correlation between the more hookworm infections you have, the lower your intelligence. That was in a European, mostly, population that was some of blacks. And after they had a 1920s campaign, 1930s, to get rid of the hookworm infection, intelligence went up. We're 100 years later, and you still have a negative stereotype of Southerners is stupid. So there's some of the factors that he did not address in bell curve and doesn't really address here. When he talks about nature versus nurture, genetics sets your potential. Environment can absolutely limit it. We don't have enough information on how the environment can limit potential. We're just starting to get the data on how genetics can define your potential, because there's large enough populations around the world to say you've got the best food, the best housing, the best medical care of any generation in human history. Now we can get the actual correlations between genetics and intelligence, and we're starting to tease out things like mental illness. But we really don't have all the data to know that as well as we could.
Yeah, I think that a great caveat here to all this stuff is that I get depressed that we look at environmental factors and say, well, we don't know how to increase intelligence or personality factors or all these things. But the truth is we do know how to decrease a lot of that. And through a large part of the world, we do decrease a lot of them by having malnutrition and all these factors that you're bringing up. That means people aren't living up to their potential. I think that's a really great caveat. I don't think Dr. Murray would disagree with that. It's not addressed in these books, but I think it's a great point.
Was that the most unsettling part for people? Because for me, that's the part I have the hardest part swallowing, which is part? That about shared environment, about environment having an impact on IQ and on personality traits.
It sucks as a parent, let me tell you. I don't want to swallow that at all. Yeah.
Because I mean, he does make the caveat that in the early years of a child's life, that it does have an impact but once they reach adolescence, shared environment doesn't have as much. So
yeah, and you see as they age, right, the correlation to genetics for a lot of these factors just increases over time, which also kind of sucks, right? But yeah, but again, even with the parenting thing and the kids, we do know ways to hurt IQ. Like there's the adverse childhood experience score, which I know Gabor Mate has talked about, and other people. Like if you have a high ACE score, different ACE than the ACE Charles Murray was talking about, but if you have an high ACE score, you don't, you're stunted. Just things like breastfeeding. I think if you don't get breastfed, you can lose like 1.5 IQ points. I'm sure malnutrition does a lot. Things like hookworm, all that stuff.
Can you define ACE for anyone listening?
It's the adverse childhood experience score. It's not the one ACE that's in this book. The ACE he talks about in this book is a totally different acronym, but I'm talking about it's an adverse childhood experience score, and it's you fill out like, did you have a 2-parent home? Was the one parent on, did you have was drugs and alcohol in the home? Were you abused? Did you have enough food? And so you can rate adverse childhood experiences, and then those do correlate to some pretty negative outcomes.
Yeah, and to that point, one of the things that it made me think of with the shared environment is I've actually seen, and I would love to see Thomas Sowell talk to Charles Murray, because I've heard people bring up Charles Murray to Thomas Sowell and his studies on the differentiation with kids. I mean, whether you're firstborn, secondborn, thirdborn, if you're a twin, what happens there? If you're a twin, but that one of the twins dies early on, that changes a lot of things. So I think that there definitely are things that happen very early on. I think there's a lot of evidence of that. But it's like to Carrie's point, the shared environment as we get older, I think so much of that is what happens early on and how quickly they learn language, how many books are in the house. Do you have a library card in the house? That was even a correlation. So I think a lot of those things get imprinted very early and probably make a big difference in the long run. And it also reminds me of those kids who were, there was a bunch of kids in Russia after the Soviet Union broke down, and there was a lot of alcoholism and a lot of abandoned kids. And a lot of these kids grew up on the streets. Some of them were even feral kids who grew up amongst animals. And they actually found some kids who ran with packs of dogs for most of their young life. And once they get them out of that situation and try to help them out, it's too late for a lot of things. They never learn language. They never learn certain cultural expectations that we have. So I think so much of that stuff does matter early on, but that's probably why it doesn't matter as much in the long run, because I think there's certain tipping points to where things have to be learned early on, or you just lose that opportunity.
That window.
Yeah. And I think Murray does, there's a universe of traits that we could categorize as personality traits, or as he would say, cognitive repertoire. But he's focusing on many of those cognitive repertoire traits that are genetic, because that's what he's interested in. But I think there's probably a whole bunch of other traits that aren't really that genetic, or at least there's that other component that you're talking about. That's like, okay, well, yeah, if you're raised with dogs, like something's wrong, or just things can get broken. Maybe it's just that things can get broken. We know how to break things really well, but we don't really know much beyond that, which is also sad. But
a lot of this book strikes me as he's having to argue against the predominant theory of the blank slate theory, that every kid is equally smart, equally creative. You see the stuff of everybody's totally creative. Okay, little kids taking various items and repurposing them as swords and guns and playing house. That's normal play behavior. But we're lying to ourselves that every kid can be an astronaut, a doctor, and a lawyer. And how much of the college system is screwed up because we lie and say everybody can be a genius, everybody can be a doctor, when we should do some of the stuff that Germany and Sweden does, and says, based on your IQ, based on your academic ability, You can't be a doctor, but you might be a nurse. And then put more vocational training, vocational support to the middle level instead of pretending everybody's a genius and let's maximize it.
Yeah. Yeah, because it does everyone a disservice. And in the US, I think, I mean, this is the other thing that I think is fascinating from like just looking at the elitist class perpetuation in the US. One way that you keep classes ensconced is by having universities and outlawing IQ tests, right? Like you can't have an IQ test as an employer or anything. You can't just do very simple stuff as an employer. You're not allowed to base your hiring off of that. If you could, you might not care whether they went to Stanford, but the universities act as proxies for IQ tests, but they're not perfect proxies because they're very expensive and they're only accessible to a certain amount, people with a certain amount of wealth in society. So it's actually outlawing IQ tests. I think it's again, when you look at stuff, when you're afraid of facts and you knee-jerk react, I think people were afraid of facts like, if we allow IQ tests, this will be used against people that we want to protect somehow. And in actuality, it's probably hurting those people because they could, an IQ test is a great way to measure someone's potential who didn't have some of the upbringing that is afforded to like an upper middle class family who can send their kids to private schools and Stanford and all that kind of stuff. But at the same, I guess we do that so that perpetuate the classism, and then we continue to ignore any correlation between IQ and anything other than upbringing. I really liked Charles Murray's observation that it's the elitist liberals who really want to be proud of their own IQ and think it was something that they worked to get rather than something that they inherited.
Yeah, and I really enjoyed, the whole interview was great. And I really enjoyed the idea that people pretend that it's offensive to look at things like this, but in their own lives, they're doing all those things. So I didn't marry my wife because she's just cute and really dumb. I took the time to think about who am I going to want to be the mother of my kids? And I know that part of it's inherited and I know that part of it's environmental, but there's nothing wrong with seeking out smart people with whom you want to have children. And we do it all the time. And people in those environments do it all the time. And they continuously live in a manner in which they tell everybody else it doesn't matter.
Yep.
I think it was New York Post or New York Times did an article on luxury beliefs are the latest status symbol for the elite, and saying white privilege, the liberals, we have to pretend everybody's equal because egalitarianism and equality equals fairness is the most important virtue for many liberals. So they have to pretend I'm just lucky or I'm privileged because of my race, and ignores, and I'll bring up William Shutterly's example. He's a communist. He's somebody I know because I reviewed his book, The Making of a Social Justice Warrior, discussing the rise of the identity politics going back 10 and 20 years that he noticed as a communist. And one of his criticisms was, you're mistaking classism for racism, and while there's some correlations of blacks were likely before, the white privilege belief lets the liberal whites look down on poor whites by going, well, why didn't you get your white privilege? You must be stupid. So they can pretend, well, I'm smarter and I'm better. So it feeds into those beliefs of the elitism. And then I'm a white savior saving the oppressed minorities, while some of the ethnic minorities that are in the elite can benefit from it and thus want to go, I'm better than you, and move on. It fits everybody's narratives unless they get to oppress you in the name of fairness.
Yeah. One thing that has always kind of struck me, and I mentioned this in our interview with Charles Murray, but one thing that has struck me is that we tend to conflate a lot of these characteristics. I mean, I think the reason that he's hated is precisely because a lot of these characteristics we really ascribe moral standards to, or like standards of value to, where it's like, oh, if you're this personality, or if you're this kind of IQ, you're better than someone who's this other personality and a lower IQ. And that I remember when first reading Bell Curve, and then listening to some other people talk about it, coming to this realization that like being proud of your IQ is like being proud of your height, or like it doesn't make any sense. You have nothing to do with it, and it's not a moral thing. And I think that's I think and you know, as I raise my daughter, that's one of the things I try and like really push forward is like how smart she is isn't a measure of how good she is. Like her behavior is a measure of how good she is. Like what she does is a measure of how good, because I don't know how smart she'll turn out to be either way anyway. But I don't know. It's weird. There's a huge part of society that these ideas are toxic because they ascribe moral value to them all.
They do. That's interesting, because my pastor in his sermon today, he was talking about racism is a form of lazy self-righteousness. It's self-righteousness for underachievers, because it's something you were born into your race. It's nothing you did. It's the same thing, right, for height or anything that you were born with, your sex or whatever. So being proud of something that you had the control over,
zero to do with.
Yeah, I guess it gets a little
secondhand self-esteem, right? It's self-esteem that's borrowed secondhand from other people. Right?
But I think it gets a little more, it's a little different when you're talking about maybe natural things that are based in both genetics and in environment, like personality traits or some of the things in this book. Because like if you look at someone, I was trying to think about, is there any other area where we assume that if you talk about differences on average between groups, that we're saying there's some kind of moral superiority. So for example, in sports, I think if you're talking about someone who's really good at basketball, or if you talk about groups and you say on average, the people at the high end of ability when it comes to basketball are less likely to be Jewish, or more likely,
right, or people talk about
Black,
Kenyans being great marathoners, right? It's like,
right,
no one cares.
Right. No one thinks that you're saying Kenyans are superior,
right?
As human beings. It's like we don't do the same thing, but maybe in some areas we do. Do we do that with talent in music or things like that? Because someone could be born with an innate gift for music, but then pair that with a lot of hard work to actually get to a place of excellence.
No, I think we do. I mean, this is why we listen to celebrities' opinion on various things. Like they're good looking and good actors, or mostly just good looking, frankly. And therefore we listen to them. Like that doesn't mean that they're right. That's not, good looking isn't an argument. But we certainly give them special credit for being hot.
Well, and to Carrie's point, I think there are some things that we ascribe that are positive to some groups that we're not supposed to always say. It's very often saying things like, if someone says, well, they're Asian, maybe they're probably good at math, or somebody says, well, maybe he's a really great programmer because he's from India. You know, those are things I wouldn't expect to be acceptable to say necessarily, and they don't necessarily apply to a whole group, but they're not themselves negative aspects of a person's personality. Being good at math isn't bad, but if you assume somebody is good at math because of their race, that's where people would probably push back.
Well, I think you're hitting on, like, I'm glad he has a appendix for statistics. I think he even titles it like statistics for people who don't think they can learn statistics, because I think a lot of the pushback on a lot of this stuff is when you're speaking about a group, you're making very broad statistical statements, and so many people get wrapped around the axle that, like, you're saying all X or Y, and it's like, no, in fact, the overlap I'm talking about is minuscule, but it does show up if you're measuring tens of millions of people, but it's still minuscule. And I think stats would solve a lot of that. I think, frankly, stats would solve maybe 50% of the outrage that we see.
Yeah, people definitely don't understand. I don't think we teach what averages mean, and that we don't teach bell curves and the amount that they overlap.
Or standard deviations, or like, what does a high variance, like he's got one of his appendices, he talks about the high variance of male intelligence relative to female intelligence. It's like, okay, well, what does that mean? Well, it might mean that you see more Nobel winning physicist men and more homeless men. That's might what it mean. And it turns out you do see both of those. Like, that's true.
I think my favorite example is when people don't get wrapped up around height too much. And when you say the standard deviation for height is X, and you say, well, most men are taller than most women. We all know that. We accept it. No one has a problem with it. But we all know that some men are shorter than some women. Yeah, no problem. So when you look at people who are 6'1", the men outnumber the women probably 10 to 1. Yep. Yeah, that's probably fair. How about 6'5", 6'7", 6'10"? It's the same thing. You know, it's just there's most of us are very similar, but the tail end of those extremes are where things stand out. Yeah. And if you've got to be 6'5", 6'10" to play basketball, then most people who play basketball at that level are going to be men. And this brings up a beef that I've got with you, Carter. I noticed during the interview.
Beefs over basketball are great, so let's go.
I noticed in the interview you said, yeah, you know, some people are Spud Webb. And it amazed me that you remembered Spud Webb. But when I said that you were going hard in the paint on one of my super chats, you had no idea what
he had no idea
what that meant.
I was like, how do you not know both of those? They're both basketball.
Because I was just tangentially related. Like, I didn't follow basketball, but growing up, Spud Webb, because I'm short. Actually, that's why I know. Because I'm short. I'm one of the people that, like, yeah, but that guy's not taller than all women. Like, yep, that's me, right? So Spud Webb, like, his existence in the NBA was a big deal to me.
You caused me to look up Spud Webb and to see pictures. Yeah, and I watched him do a lot of slam dunks, and he's 5'5". That's just 1 inch taller than me. And he was floated up there.
Yeah.
You know, I spent like I think there were many Saturday afternoons in our driveway with me convincing myself that I should be able to dunk also, because he can dunk. Mm-hmm. I don't think I maybe touched the net a couple times, but that was not as high as I could get.
To bring it full circle to human diversity, you know what? Maybe there is some genetic difference between you and Spud Webb when it comes to jumping.
Look, the guy's got like magical springy legs, so yeah, I get that. That's totally true. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, yeah, to bring it back, I do think it's tough because a lot of people get their self-esteem through traits that through something that required no work of their own. And so it's threatening to them to tell them this is genetic. And, you know, the thing I was thinking about more generally, maybe we can see what you guys think about this. Humans, we used to have like a couple hundred people in our friends circles. Like, those were our community sizes. I'll say friend circle, like our communities were tiny, right? And so they were necessarily much more both genetically homogeneous and homogeneous, and just culturally homogeneous. Like, we all have the same customs, and like our standards were the same, even if they're not genetic. It was a very small group. And I think, you know, if you're going to try the Enlightenment experiment, which clearly I am in love with, and you're going to have all different people come in with different genetics and different cultures and different standards and different ways of doing things, you really can't bury your head in the sand when it comes to actual differences between those groups and lament when you see outcomes that are different. Like, there are differences between groups, and to try and pretend that if we just say, hey, let's all have a society based on ostensibly a meritocracy, although we're not quite there, but whatever. Let's have a society based on individual rights, and let's see, let the chips fall where they may. Because humans are different, you would expect some people to be, fitting some stereotypes. Maybe Asians are better at math on average. I don't know if that's true, but like maybe you are going to have more Jewish bankers than you are other people. Maybe you're going to have singers that are a certain gender or race or whatever. Like all that stuff is going to happen. And I think it's extremely dangerous to try and have an Enlightenment-based society and actively ignore the reality of the differences between people, because otherwise you end up with this conclusion that something's wrong with our society. Because there's a difference, automatically there's some evil that we have to go root out, and it becomes a McCarthyism, which is an insult to McCarthy actually, but it becomes like a McCarthyism for, it's like, it's a witch hunt. It's a witch hunt for evil that may not exist because you're just burying your head in the sand about differences between people.
We have such a diverse society that we're getting much more tribal, and identity politics imposes that. And that's why we had the Black attorney general who's in an interracial marriage get demonized as racist. No, he's Black. And then they went, he's skin folk, but not kinfolk. That's like saying he's an apostate, he's not a member of the tribe. He may be Black, but he's a traitor, so you don't have to respect him or protect him as a Black, so he's a fair target to go after. He betrayed the tribe, get him. So we're seeing—
Yeah, he becomes a traitor. Yeah.
We're seeing a convergence back to when you had a fairly homogenous majority and is trickling in of minority groups, Italians, Poles, Mexicans. Then you come in and you get Lithuanian Jews and Chinese, and you get a slow trickle that could assimilate. You had a generalizing of the popular culture helped by mass media. And then now that you've had floods of immigration, reinforcing existing groups and bringing in new ones in large enough communities to form their own communities, like the Somalis in Minnesota, now you get a reversion to tribalism. And a lot of the social justice stuff is saying your identity is tied to your demographics. Your demographics are your identity. You are morally obligated to live out your stereotype to prove you're a member of the tribe, because we don't want a Buddhist white guy. Well, maybe they'll tolerate that, but you can't be Native American and Buddhist. You can't be Cuban and Jewish. We want everybody to fit in this narrow mold. And it's a reversion to the really old tribalism, like Judaism being both an ethnicity and a religion. And yeah, it's like 10% overlap each way. If 10% are about converts in, mostly to marry in, and about 10% of Jews are Buddhist or atheist instead. But it's a really strong correlation. And now we're seeing a push back to the tribal morality. I think Jonathan Crate could talk about that in the prior books of you have to live this stereotype, you have to be this way. So we even see this in the college admissions. The Black kid who says, I want to be an investment banker, doesn't get the scholarships of the one who says, I want to be an activist, I'm living out these appropriate lived experiences. We're kind of going, nobody can be in the middle. You have to be in your channel, and that makes society safe so that I can look at you and based on your uniform and your demographics, know who you are and what you're doing. That's simpler. Go stay in your safe space and don't come out unless it's these very strict rules. So we're getting a version back to when you look at some of the Mexican villages and everybody's got their own uniform. And you have your own uniform on the bright blue outfits and the girls in the pink dresses, or your tartan patterns in Scotland going, here's my uniform, you know my identity, you know my tribe, you know my faith, just by looking at you. And we're seeing a societal reversion to that tribalism for various groups, and then pushing people one way or the other, because we don't really want the diversity, or we want the superficial cultural diversity, but we don't want to have individual choice because that erodes the protective tribe, because each tribe wants to be strong. Historically, the more cohesive group, if you have two groups of similar sizes, the more cohesive group wins over the more divided one. And when you've got democracy with diverse groups, you get something akin to Nigeria. Everybody votes their tribe. And the Democrats are saying, everybody unite the tribe so that we can have our little groups and organize the groups into the umbrella. And that's the basis. And then demonize everybody else.
Right. Right.
Sorry.
I do wonder sometimes, not to be a downer, but I do wonder sometimes if there's such a innate propensity for tribalism in humans that we're going to have to find some safety valve if we're going to have a society that we don't want people to be tribal in normally. We need an outlet for that tribalism in some way. I used to wonder if sports were that outlet.
Sports.
Right? We're like, yeah, here's our tribalism. We can like, we can have a team where if like, tomorrow Thomas and I are all Pittsburgh Penguins fans and Manny and Keith and Carrie are all New Jersey Devils fans. We can hate on each other, but go out for beers afterwards and like have that tribalism that we want, where it doesn't actually affect our lives in a meaningful way. It just becomes symbolic.
One of the things I worry about with sports disappearing, because I'm not a huge sports fan, but I do see how connected people of all different kinds are. And now that we're worried about whether or not people that smash each other in the head are going to catch COVID, I'm worried about, how ironic is that? We can't play football. We might get a really bad infection. So
never mind all the problems we're doing.
I know. TBI, you're good, but don't catch COVID.
Yeah. The brain damage didn't stop us, but COVID will.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And similar to that, I think the military service is a really good way of bringing a lot of people from different areas together. And that's one of the things I see in Israel. And not that I would say we should do that here in America, because most of the people that don't want to be in the military, I don't want them in the military. Right. And we are way too big to have everybody do that kind of service. But I think something along those lines, where all these people from different places and different classes and different colors and whatever come together and have to do something like that. I think that's really helpful.
Yeah. But you don't think it's sports?
Oh, no, I think sports is also a really good thing. I'm just worried about what's happening to sports now, because it's getting politicized and people are moving away from it. Oh. And the problem with COVID also shutting it down. So that's one more thing that we can't all get along with.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that is, I wonder if sports, there's going to have to be another outlet. And I guess it could be people produce their own parallel sporting tribal events somehow, or
Dungeons and Dragons.
They join Antifa, or they do something else. As in what?
Dungeons and Dragons.
Right. We have a D&D group now. So that's, although our D&D group, no one that's on the channel right now is in the group, but I will say we don't actually represent the very cohesive tribe. So I don't know if that well.
So did anybody else have, I know we started with Carter, you asked a question of general thoughts on the book of Tamara. Did anybody else have any general or broad thoughts that they wanted to share about it? Or maybe a particular part that, like I said, there was a part that didn't sit well with me. And was there any part that gave you concern?
I thought that, and you guys brought this up a little bit on the interview, every time I read a book like this, where that has so much backing in science that I can go and look up myself, which much of it I did, similar to what Dr. Deborah So has put out with her gender book. I forgot what it's called. It's very similar to that. It amazes me how contentious these ideas are, and it underlines or underscores the fact for me that there's a lot of things going on in academia that people are kind of being really hush hush about. And I don't understand how it's not getting out into the public and becoming just kind of normal knowledge. I mean, I kind of know how, but I'm still amazed at the cognitive dissonance between what we are starting to learn and what people actually think is their truth or their common sense. And I'm really curious what the thing or things are going to be, like with some of the SNPs. Is that what it was called, Carter? You guys talked
Yeah,
about
the SNPs. Yeah, the polygenic stuff.
yeah, how long it's going to take for that to come out? And I had listened to, after reading the bell curve, I listened to a podcast that had to do with IQ. It was a whole series, and one of the things that they did is they talked to a company that helps people do maybe IVF or whatever it is. I don't remember what specifically it was, but the parents were able to choose the gender of the fertilized eggs that they were going to have implanted. And this company was going beyond that. They were actually testing a lot of the genetics for markers that they already knew um, gave rise to other traits. And it was funny when they were interviewing this guy, you can tell he was kind of hush hush. He didn't want to say too much because they were asking about intelligence. But it gave me the impression that there are companies out there that are utilizing this information to start testing these things for intelligence before they actually get implanted. And that brings up a whole lot of other things, which I think is some of the stuff people push back against because they're worried about that happening. But it also does mean that those things are real, because if people are testing it and it's coming true, it's much more than just saying high IQ is related later on in life to success in various different ways. This is literally saying, here are some genes that we think create this type of trait, and that person ends up with that trait every single time, and you can pay for it. So at some point, all of this contention about, well, it's not real, you're just pushing this, or you're a eugenicist, you're a white nationalist. I went to the SPLC page about him. God, that was horrible.
Wasn't it bad?
That was so bad. But at some point, it's going to be like, guys, you're on the wrong side of science. If science is real in your house, you better start paying attention to this stuff. It's not everything, but it does make a difference.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that gives me heartburn, by the way, is that like all this aversion to this subject is uniquely Western. I can tell you right now, China doesn't give a crap about your feelings about these things. They will intentionally engineer the highest IQ people that they can, and they have no qualms about it. They don't. If someone says, "I've got a IVF method to test X, Y, and Z, and we think we can do A, B, and C to, basically implement eugenics," no one will bat an eye. There's no one protesting. There's no one will care. They'll be like, "Great, thanks. We want a smarter population." Like that's
okay,
what will
cool.
happen.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
Right. And I don't think it's going to take very long. I mean, you could imagine 4, 5, 6 generations later of that being implemented when we're just not even in the same category as China anymore. Like the rest of the world is just
Jason Bourne's, and we're over here just trying to make sure everybody's really not.
Yeah.
You know what? They're really smart and they're really talented and they can do this and that, but we're really super nice and aware of feelings and empathetic.
Exactly.
Like, wow, they're going to beat the crap out of us now.
We're very sensitive.
Yeah, we're very sensitive.
we bred the gene for being offended very easily.
Yeah, it's like, okay, good luck.
It's like it could be a version of what natural selection does, but could happen in just a couple generations. They started doing that wild scale. Maybe they'll go from 105 to 115 average IQ in a couple generations. What would
That's a big difference?
Competitiveness.
Yeah. The thing that I think is, I mean, we can get into territory that's extremely dangerous, but like, the thing that I don't like is this idea that you can't talk about these things without being accused of like eugenic, like, oh, you're a eugenicist or you're this or you're that. The truth is, no matter what environment we're in, there are pressures evolutionarily to push us towards some optimization for that environment. And so talking about the fact that, hey, there are pressures that optimize for a certain thing should we worry about that and maybe make sure they're optimizing for something better? Like that's not a conversation that only evil Nazis have. That's a conversation that people who recognize the truth of some of this have and say, okay, well, we are pushing, like there are things happening right now. We're optimizing for a certain thing right now. Is that the right thing to optimize for as a society?
A good example.
And obviously, I don't mean using force because
right, not force. A good example is, I would say, we know that children on average do better when they have both parents in the home, and at the same time, some would argue, and I think they make very good arguments, that our government is creating an incentive not to have parents in the home, both parents in the home, for many people. And that it's almost like when we have policies or laws that are passed or programs that we adopt with good intention, I think sometimes we have trouble then looking at the results and measuring what are the consequences and what kind of incentives do we set up, and did we do disincentives as well? Or, we have trouble looking at the outcome because we're just focused on the intent of things.
That reminds me of what Carter just said, to where, what if somewhere in another country they say, whatever, we're going to optimize for this thing and beat America out. Now, what you said, Carrie, is happening actually within America amongst groups, to where they're saying, well, we can incentivize behavior that puts people in harm's way. And then also this other group, we're gonna actually act in a very different way. So it's like they're pulling those two things together. It kind of reminds me of what he was saying in the bell curve, with pulling people with different higher IQs into those areas, or even with coming apart, how things are getting separated because they're incentivizing some of the bad behavior, but also incentivizing those who can to do even better and pull further and further apart.
Yes, it's weird. It's like the part of the discussion with Dr. Murray when we were talking about, I think we were talking about this topic, but about how there is this tendency of elite, usually leftist, in terms of belief system, elite leftist people who will preach that all of these things are okay and good and you shouldn't criticize them, yet they don't live that way themselves. Mm-hmm. It's like, we shouldn't criticize a destruction of the nuclear family, and it would be bigoted or somehow bigoted or wrong or hurt people's feelings to speak the truth that kids do better with both parents in the home on average, but they have both parents in the home. It's like it's one rule for thee and another for me. It's weird.
On IQ is an example of one rule for me. Like, they wouldn't make IQ testing for an employer illegal if they didn't know it worked. Like, that proves they know it worked.
Right.
If they actually thought it didn't know it worked, then they wouldn't make a rule about it, and people would try it, other people would, and then they would stop using it. It means they know.
They wouldn't be afraid of it. Yeah.
That's why they're not afraid of the inherent bias test, because that doesn't work.
Yeah.
And there is an exception. Yeah. Inherent bias test. I don't know if you guys know about the exception, but there is one exception in the US. It's widespread IQ test.
Military.
The military, to get into any branch of the US military, they do a test, and they're measuring G. I looked it up when I was reading this book. Like, that's what they're trying to measure, G. What he talks about.
Yeah. I don't know if you know this, Keith, but some law enforcement does it as well. They're allowed to. And but they have a ceiling. You can't be a cop if it's above a certain amount, because they're worried that you'll leave and go on to be in the FBI or something. And
okay. I thought it's like, what is the ceiling? 85?
No, I don't know.
Oh, that hurts.
Yeah, I just looked that up.
I don't agree with that.
I was trying to remember where that was, but this is an article from the year 2000. Court okays barring high IQs for cops.
Right.
This was in Connecticut, and it was about a man who tried to become a police officer, but he was rejected after he scored too high on an IQ test.
They don't say how high he scored, though.
But he lost his appeal in a federal lawsuit against the city.
Yeah, I'm curious what his score was.
Yeah.
It doesn't have the number?
What his score is? Let me see. But it's interesting.
I mean, I saw someone in go ahead. Do you have a number?
He scored 33 points, the equivalent of an IQ of 125.
Oh, so that's not even like
that's
not like genius level.
I know.
That's smart. Above average.
But it's above average, but it's not, you know,
I mean, it's more than a standard deviation above average, but it's not like he's not going to go be Oppenheimer.
So this particular police department would only accept candidates who scored 20 to 27 points, on the theory that those who scored too high could get bored with the police work and leave soon after.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that may be.
Maybe they found that was true.
Yeah.
The military, the equivalent of what they measure, I forgot the name of the test, but they're measuring the IQ. It's about 85. It's equivalent to about 85. And what they say is that over the years, they've found that someone with an IQ below 85 can't be assigned to anything in the military that makes them worth the expense of having them. And that includes like collecting the trash, I guess. Right?
Yeah.
You have to collect the trash in the military. Yeah. They're saying it's not worth it.
Yeah, and they utilize a lot of those scores because they break them up into different aptitude tests that you can correlate to IQ, and they use that to help assign your job. So anything from infantry, no offense to my buddies, anything from infantry to being a nuclear tech in a submarine, you've got to understand a lot of different types of things and have different aptitudes, and apparently it works. So that, like you said, the proof is in the pudding because they use those scores, they actually work, so they mean something.
Yep.
And it's not for you. We believe it, we're going to use it, and you're not allowed.
Yep. There's also, just to get back to that idea of how we seem to, as a society, give this undue moral value to certain traits like IQ, and not to others. And when we do that, we also tend to, because we're giving it an inherent positive or superiority, or we're viewing a higher IQ as superior in some way, but it ignores the fact that a lot of people that are on that very high end of IQ it does cause problems for them. For some, it's not always a positive thing. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be the best employee or you're going to be able to relate to and get along with others. Or it's not I wouldn't say, I know they say IQ is one of the predictors of success, but it's also, you can have an IQ that it really inhibits your success.
Dr. Murray brought up that it can be a requirement in some places. So if you look at, Harvard professors, CEOs of top companies, whatever, lawyers, engineers, they tend to have a higher IQ, but it doesn't mean that everyone with a high IQ is going to become an engineer or the president, I like this example he brought up of the linebacker. He said, it is actually a requirement and it helps to be strong and heavy to be a linebacker, but the best linebacker on the team isn't the heaviest one. But you got to be over 300 pounds or you can't even be in the game. Right?
Can't compete.
So it's the same with IQ. So if you start looking at individual examples, there's always the weird genius dweeb that you can't even talk to, right? But they're kind of outliers. He said several times, I think in the interview and in the book, that IQ is actually the best predictor for a whole bunch of different measures of success, from career success to marriage length.
Yep.
IQ is the number one thing that is now known.
Yeah, then I wonder if people would say, well, that's the problem. We shouldn't live in a society where so much is based on something that you didn't yourself earn. You're just lucky to have a good IQ, lucky to have good parents. So what about everyone else? Should we just forget about them? Which, I think there's a lot more opportunities out there for people, regardless of what their IQ is, within certain ranges. But I think that's a fair question to ask.
How do we celebrate it? Like, okay, so you shouldn't feel proud of a high IQ. It's like, I get that. That's like being proud of being 300 pounds when you're a linebacker. You can be proud that you used your innate physical ability and worked out hard your whole life and became good at that. You can be proud of doing a scientific achievement. So you say, okay, just consider yourself lucky, but it still is a merit. It still should be celebrated. Just like we celebrate a 6'8" guy on the NBA. I don't, but Americans do. I could care less. But well, that is, it's a society. It's okay to celebrate that. You could say that this guy's just amazing. He's 7 foot tall. He's amazing. We're allowed to celebrate that. And like, that's luck too, right? It's the same as IQ. Why can't we celebrate high IQ in a kid?
No, I think you can celebrate it. You just it's just not a moral thing, right? So you can be like, yeah, this is amazing. This is an amazing talent and an amazing gift. It doesn't make you a good person. You might turn out to be an evil genius and be horribly now, incidentally, IQ actually, if I recall from the bell curve, it's also correlated to morality in weird ways. So like, probably the evil genius is a little bit of a Hollywood fantasy, but what I'd like to see teased out, and I don't remember the reference to this, but I vaguely recall something about this with respect to a study on CEOs. I'd like to see teased out the difference between being, let's say, 2 standard deviations above the mean and like a stone cold 180 genius. My guess is that there's a sweet spot for IQ somewhere between 125 and 145 that is very successful, and that beyond that, it's just a guess, but beyond that is where you start to see breakdown of the ability to communicate with enough people and to relate to people in a way that makes them capable of rising to CEO level. They might rise to like a very specific scientific endeavor. They might be excellent scientists somewhere. But I think because CEOs have weird traits, right? They have a much higher incidence of psychopathy. Like there's a lot of things that are necessary to be CEOs. And I think one of them is relatability to, more average people. And I'm just wondering, I'm curious if like, does the 180 IQ guy just have a really hard time talking to the person at the checkout?
Whereas I think so.
The 140 guy's like, I know how to relate to you still. I mean, I'm over 2 standard deviations above you, but I can still relate to you, right? Like,
I think it's possible.
You can typically relate to people plus or minus 2 sigma IQ points. So when they're at 3 and 4 sigma of IQ, that is very common. But they did find that the sweet spot for violent crime is around an IQ of 90, 85 to 90. And, it's kind of like, if you're a whole lot higher on in intelligence, if you want to be a thief, you're going to be selling whole life insurance or used cars or
Bernie Madoff
sales funnels based on my wealth building program. You find legitimate ways to rip people off without getting into trouble instead of
legitimate rip off.
Chairman of the Fed, that kind of stuff.
I mean, that's the example I was using.
Exactly.
Yeah, if you have an IQ of 105, you want to be a criminal, be a senator. Like they're not, that isn't the people pickpocketing.
Right.
It's 80 IQ people become pickpockets.
Yeah. Right. And below that, I guess they just can't even do, they're not even functional enough to be criminals. Is that the?
No, it's the propensity for violence drops. Like Tamara said, 85. Yeah, you're saying it's 85 to 90. I just remember 85. I don't remember the number perfectly, but it's around there is the peak of the violent crime. And it drops off equally in both sides. It's a bell curve, drops off equally.
What were you saying, Manny?
No, I was going to say that one of the things we do in talking about IQ is as humans, we are always trying to compare each other or to put like some way of measuring it. That's where the IQ comes in, right? We sort of value ourselves, or people value us based on some measure that's been come up with, like an IQ, which, like you said, is great, but it's not something that you necessarily work for necessarily, right? But what's more important really is what you do with whatever ability you were born with. That's the really important thing. And unfortunately, the society, the world we live in, sometimes don't look at that, right? They look at things like IQ by itself and say, well, this guy is good and this guy is not as good. And that should never be that way. It's,
yep.
But, it's hard.
Do they do that? I was actually wondering as you're saying that, because I agree with what you're saying, but I'm now wondering, like, do they do that? Because I definitely have seen people despise smart people who are wasting their talent. Like, actually, any talented person who's wasting their talent, their friends and family tend to like be hard on them for wasting their gifts, right? Like the standards are higher. And I know I've had people in my life that I've had like a rocky relationship with because I felt like they had talents that were they gave them a lot more potential, but they were just sitting on the couch playing video games or doing whatever they're doing, like drinking their life away or whatever it was. And like whereas someone who's an IQ of 85, if they're holding down a job at the 7-Eleven and sitting on the couch playing video games the rest of the time, like I'm going to leave them alone. But someone with an IQ of 150 who's doing that is going to get an earful from me.
Isn't like that from each according to his ability, to each according to his need?
Well, yeah, I'm a communist secretly.
It is. I think you're right. I think people are a little more harsh for good reason because when they see someone talented who's wasting it because they want the best for that person. And sometimes things just get in people's way. I worked in comedy, as some of you know, and there's a comedian that I know who he's, I mean, if you ask other comedians, like well-known comedians, A-list comedians that people consider to be really good about this guy, they will tell you he's the funniest comedian. He's the most talented. They all know who he is, but most of the public doesn't know who he is because in a way, I think he was so talented, or he is so talented that it would be easy to go on stage and just kill and just have an audience cracking up without having to work hard for it. So it's almost like not putting in the same amount of work as people who were maybe less talented innately, but really worked their butts off to get somewhere, and looking at that, it's like, what is standing in your way? Because you have this innate talent, but in some ways it's almost set you up for failure because you haven't had the experience of having to work hard. I know I've read studies about how gifted kids are sometimes have a problem with putting in work and also have a problem with committing to things, because if it doesn't come naturally easy to them, like whatever their gift is, that they expect everything. Like if I'm talented in this area and it just comes naturally to me, and then this other thing I'm trying doesn't, well, I'm just going to give that up because I've got this expectation that it should just be easy, without putting in a lot of work.
Yeah, that's 100% true. No, that's 100% true, Carrie. And it made me think of, like, I think one of the worst things you can do to your kids is to put them in an environment in which they're not challenged. Because I've seen, I mean, mea culpa, I certainly had a childhood that, like, I have some bad negative personality traits precisely because I was bored out of my mind in elementary school and high school. And I've seen other kids do it. And like, it's hard to get out of the bad habits. You get into bad habits when no one's challenging you. You get into really bad habits, and you get used to everything being super easy. And as soon as a challenge comes along, you're way more intimidated by it than you should be because you've never actually dealt with a challenge before. So yeah, that's one of the reasons you really, really need to make sure you're challenging your kids in a way that, they fail sometimes, and they succeed sometimes, but there's that like balance where they learn to apply themselves. And I think the reason, the communist thing was a joke, but I think the reason that I'm harder on someone with high IQ who's sitting on the couch not doing anything with it is not really that they owe society, it's that they owe themselves. They're not going to be happy doing that. You will feel unfulfilled if you're not challenging yourself. I mean, one of the best things to do for your self-esteem is to find a big mountain metaphorically that looks intimidating and climb it. Like, there's nothing better for self-esteem than doing that. And, if instead of mountains, you're putting little pebbles in front of you, it's like, I'm going to get to the next level on this video game. It's like, all right, well, you're not going to be happy. You're just setting yourself up for real depression.
And the schools do that. They try to cater to the average or the lowest common denominator. So you get a class with 20 kids, that's going to happen to Dr. Murray in the book brought up the charter schools are the type of schools that just get rid of the disruptive kids. Like that,
Right.
They know how to self-select for people who want to help themselves, children and adults. Like everybody knows how to do that. We can help these people. The ones that don't want to help themselves, I don't know what to do about them either, but bringing down the kids that do want to help themselves is a terrible way to handle them. The mainstream media and yeah, I saw a lot of bored kids. I'm not surprised Carter was bored in school. I was bored in school. A lot of my friends,
a lot of people were bored. Yeah.
You know, I probably had a friend base that was like, you know, somewhere between average and one standard deviation above average, and we were all bored. I mean, for me, and I'm not that high above average, but I got in trouble a lot, grammar school and junior high school, because I used to always sit with a book underneath those little old desks we had where it had a slot. And I would sit and read a book all day. I used to read like a book every 2 days throughout grammar school and junior high. And, you know, the teacher would come back and yell at me, and I would just say, well, I can hear what you're doing and read my book. Like, I have no problem doing both these at the same time. Like, I can keep up with what you're doing and read my book. What do you mad at?
Yeah.
I used to tell them that, and most teachers would go, all right. I got sent to the principal's office for it. And I'm not a genius by no means, but the way the school was, and my high school was a little better. Then I got to college, went to University of Maryland, went into engineering school. The first day I was like, oh shit, I guess I'm, I think I drafted, like, I was like 12th in my high school class out of 300. Then I got to college and like, I don't think I'm even at the middle of the pack now. Like to engineering school, I was like, wow, it was a big eye opening my freshman year.
That's like,
I was no longer above average, I don't think.
I went to a science and math school. It's called the Governor's School of South Carolina. And you go and you live there for 11th and 12th grade, and they pick, you know, presumably the best and brightest from all around the state. And the idea is to have this intensive science and math focused, STEM focused boarding school to really, because South Carolina has one of the lowest education rates. We have some of the lowest numbers in the country. And so a lot of the states with these low numbers have formed these schools. They're public schools. You don't pay to go, but you do have to get in. And it was a lot more rigorous than where I ended up going to college, which was Duke. And it was such a humbling, eye-opening experience, like you said, because the public schools weren't challenging. And I lived in such a small town that I wasn't exposed to other people who challenged or humbled me until I got to go to that school. And then I was like, oh, I'm not the smartest person in the world. I'm not even close. You're like, oh, I'm going to have to work now. I'm going to have to learn things like how to study and how to do things like, you know, like you said, prepare. And I imagine it's the same for people with musical ability or like sports ability. If they're not put in a place where they're challenged, like, can you imagine being someone who's really good at basketball and you're at a school that maybe doesn't have a basketball team, or at a school where you're just put in like a gym class with people of average ability and or below, you know, that's not catering to whatever your gift is. I really see this as a problem when it comes to, again, for some reason we treat IQ differently than something like ability in a sport. And we, you know, in New York, for example, Carter and I did a whole episode where they've now started, they are trying to, in some of the public schools, attack gifted programs and to do away with gifted programs because of this idea of like elitism and this misguided idea that if you keep the kids who are a little above average or maybe on the high end, that if you keep them in the class with people who are not performing at average level, that it's going to help them. But the studies don't show that. The studies show the opposite, that it pulls those kids down and it holds them back. And it doesn't actually help to pull up the grades of other people.
It reminds me of what Carter started with, where he was talking about it's easy to bring people down, but we don't know how to bring them up. But every time we figure out how to at least keep them level, somebody's trying to do the opposite. And Keith, what you were mentioning earlier about the schools encouraging the gifted, I think Dr. Murray in the bell curve mentioned that the funding for special education is insanely high as compared to the funding for the gifted, which is like 5% of what the funding for the special education is. So why is it such an imbalance, and what is it about our culture that we focus so much on? Not that we shouldn't focus on that group, but why is it such an imbalance as compared to helping those who are at that other end? And I think some of the idea is, well, they don't need help, they're already smart. But it's like, you know, they need those challenges. They need to be more than just lucky to have a high IQ.
Like it's evil to think the more successful probability ones, they're the ones you should spend more money on for using public funds. Like the example you brought up,
at least the
and what
same.
Carrie talked about,
I would say the same, yeah.
I would say, why are you using public funds? There's no such thing as public funds in Maury. I don't know what
Bingo.
Well, in the reality, right, with the public
school. I
know.
So
I know. So in that framework. So what Carrie's saying, like their goal isn't to have the smartest kids be super successful. The number one goal is to help the kids at the bottom of the rung come up somewhere near average, and they're willing to sacrifice the smarter kids for it. It's backwards. I have a cousin that teaches in a public school. She's a counselor. I think it's like a sociology degree or something. And her job is she gets assigned a kid at the beginning of the year that's like shouldn't even be in the public school probably, who's like so far behind and so terrible in so many different ways at that level that they need a full-time person to just be with them full-time. Goes to the class with them, takes them aside. Like that's a full-time job. Like I'm flabbergasted. Like I asked her one time, did they ever think about having a full-time job where you pick the smartest kid in the whole school out and assign somebody full-time to challenge them? Like that would be a better thing to do.
Right. And if you're going to go after public, I reject the public good argument generally. And I understand the fairness argument of applying equal resources. But if you're going to go with the public good argument, your resources should be skewed towards the smarter kids because they're way more likely to produce way more value for society. Way more, like exponentially more value. They could go on to cure cancer. That's way more valuable than bringing some kid up who like will be able to hold down a job versus having to be on the public dole. Like that's not I mean, if you're going to make that argument, you should be spending. I don't think you should make a public good argument. I think public schools shouldn't exist, and we shouldn't be having this discussion because it's up to the parents. But if you're going to have that discussion, they're absolutely doing it the reverse of the way it should be done.
It's a hypocritical argument. Not that it's any like brilliant flash of imagination to point out they're being hypocritical. But yeah,
but why don't they do the same things with something like, let's take music? You know, nobody's attacking intensive music programs or you know, schools for the kids who are musically gifted.
Because it doesn't correlate with IQ. Look at Susan Boyle's case. The lady who had low IQ and got on the British Voice and got the contract and made a lot of money. Musical talent is independent of intelligence, so it doesn't feel like you're being unfair. That ability is somewhat randomly sprinkled. Right. I do need to bring up there's a public good argument for the special needs programs because it's expensive to have somebody warehoused in an institution because of mental illness or low intelligence. So a lot of the special needs funding the goal is get them enough training when they're young so that they can live with family and function in society instead of $100,000 a year living in an institution for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, I'm not arguing there's not an argument there, but what I'm saying is they're ignoring the upside of the gifted kids, which is by far more contributed to society. I mean, just look at the we talked about the Price law or Pareto, it was Price, right? The 80-20 rule, like look, those gifted kids are going to do way more to bring up the standard of living for everyone. You're going to find likely, because IQ does correlate to success, very obviously, we've talked about it. So those gifted kids are more likely to add value to society. If that's your argument, if it's a public value argument, yeah, you don't ignore the kids you're talking about, Tamara. Like, yeah, there is value there. You don't want them in institutions. You don't want to spend the money there. Like, there's some work that you could probably make an argument for. But at the high end, your dollar goes way farther. Every dollar spent goes way farther.
The only way to make that as the public good argument is to say that the public is responsible for every person. It requires denying individualism, right? Like everybody's responsible for everybody.
Right. But we could, someone in chat mentioned John Taylor Gatto, who is one of my favorite people to read about education. We could just abolish public schools, and then we wouldn't have to have this discussion. And a parent who wanted to spend more resources on their kid for whatever reason could do that.
Like Little House on the Prairie, just go to a local little school place and have someone teach our kids, or do it yourself.
Yeah, or what's happening now. I know, Keith, you were teaching in a homeschooling group now because of COVID. There's these homeschooling collectives that are forming, and I know they're much different than public school.
I taught 5 classes in a public school this spring, and then last week I taught 2 classes in a homeschool collaborative. Like, there's a stunning difference in kids in those classes. And homeschool collaborative, if the kids are disruptive, they just throw them out. Like, it's no problem. You're gone. You don't want to work.
I wanted to talk, if I could interject now, and I wanted to, because we're focusing kind of on some of maybe the last third of the book. But I wanted to go back to the beginning of the book where he's talking about sex differences and some of the interesting things there, which a lot of these things, I correct me if I'm wrong, we've known for a while. It's just that the evidence and the studies are really making it hard to argue with these things now. Like, for example, that women prefer, on average, to work with people rather than things, and men prefer to work with things rather than people. On average, again, there's always going to be a Spud. What's his name?
Spud
Webb. Spud Webb. There's always going to be a Spud Webb. But yeah. So some of that stuff I thought was interesting, especially the point about, and maybe you guys are all familiar with this, especially if you saw the interview we did with Dr. Murray, but the studies that have found that, contrary to what you would think, it's almost counterintuitive, but in the countries that are more egalitarian, like some of the Scandinavian countries, you see a greater amount of these sex differences of things that people, it's almost like in a country where you have ultimate freedom to choose whatever you want to do, regardless of sex, then you start to see some of these differences a little more clearly, because women are now choosing to do exactly what they want, and men are choosing to do what they want. And so there's actually greater differences between the sexes in those countries. What did you guys think about that section?
That was very, very interesting. I also saw that, Carrie, and it's like you said, counterintuitive, right? What you would think, or what supposedly people think is going to happen, and then you go see what happens in a place like Norway, where everybody has freedom to do whatever they want. You see the differences in the sexes in what they decide they want to do, because for whatever reason, obviously in the past, women weren't treated as equally as men in certain and things, right? They couldn't vote, but we've evolved from then. And I believe women can do anything they want to do, to tell you the truth. But they have some preferences that are based probably on things that are innate to women, like you said, and like he was talking about in the book. They prefer to deal with people. Men like to work with things. They like to work with, things they're not as good. I can tell, like, if I compare myself to a woman, I know I'm not as good as a woman dealing with others.
So you're not an outlier.
No, I'm not.
I think also I like the part where he was, again, because we tend to put this moral value on differences that we shouldn't. And I like the point he made about how he was giving an example about how men on average are better about spatial, spatial and visual, and women have on average better memory. And he said, so for example, men and women on average will have different ways of remembering how to get different ways of remembering directions to a place. Yeah. So women are more likely to remember locations, whereas men are more likely to do a map in their head. And I thought that's so fascinating, and both work.
Yeah.
It's not like one is better than the other.
The other thing about memory that really resonated with me, because I I've known a lot about the sex differences. I had read the bell curve and read other stuff, so I felt like I was pretty well versed. But one thing I didn't realize was on the memory thing, and it was great, Carrie, because it felt my wife and I have been noticing this about me, and I was feeling broken because she was like, and I had come to this conclusion. I said, I tend to just remember like the essence of something and throw away the details. That's just the way my memory works. And she was like, that's weird. I can't believe your memory works that way. But we've just kind of like gotten used to like, that's the way dad is. Dad remembers the essence of something, but throws away the details. And I described it a little bit differently. It's like I integrate it into my knowledge and then I lose the concretes and I keep the abstract. But then we read that part and then I was like, oh, that's just what guys do. Like, okay, I'm not broken. That's just what guys do on average.
Well, social justice is teaching.
I may also be broken.
That men are broken women, so.
Oh, that's true. I'm still broken. Thank you.
Yeah, I like the whole first sections. Like he says, gender is a social construct. That's the premise. Let's check this out. And it's just this beautifully fact-ridden thing filled with numbers and graphs. And you get done, I'm like, yep, that's not true. Like, how can anybody be saying that? This should have like explosive. This should be all over the place. He says the New York Times didn't even review it.
I thought it was,
that's fascinating. I got done reading it, but and my response at the end was just like, yeah, no shit. Like, yeah, everybody knows this. They just won't admit it.
Right. Yeah. It's amazing that in 2020, a book like this has to be written. I mean, a book like this would maybe be written anyway, based like, hey, FYI, here's the state of the art, the state of the science. Like, okay, that's good. But the fact that it has to be written in such, we're using such language like, hey, everyone, I'm going to make some statements.
Carefully.
Try not to freak out. There's sexual dimorphism.
Yeah, women think different than men. Like, yeah. Memory's one of them. It's very useful. I think it's useful.
Men can't have babies. Women can. There's things that are different between men and women.
Whoa. That's some hate speech there, Manny. I don't know.
Yeah, right.
You can get that on Twitter. You get banned from Twitter for saying that.
Oh my gosh.
And I was really interested in some of the developmental stuff where there's those two different time spans before a young man is even born, where testosterone actually starts to change the formation of that person's physiology and their brain. And even after birth, 3 months later, there's the I think they called it the early puberty at 3 months. So by the time my son was 3 to 4 months old, he had already had 3 surges of testosterone, 2 of them in utero, 1 as an infant. And now we have to still explain why men and women may, on average, have differences in the way we think about things and the way we act. It's like, it's just so deep, the amount of science that says, no, social constructionism isn't real. Gender is a social construct. No, it is affected by our environment and the manner in which we express ourselves. But for anyone to say that science is real in their house and also say gender is a social construct, and I hear this from really smart people. I've heard this explained to me by someone who had a doctorate in psychology, and child psychology, no less. And to me, now knowing all of this stuff and all of the extensive studies for decades, it blows my mind. But it also reminds me how an idea or an ideology can trump all of this stuff and almost turn it into like what John McWhorter is talking about, where it's starting to become a religion, because you have this whole area of your brain which is not going to be affected by anything that comes into it that's counter to it, even if you're completely realistic and reasonable and smart over here. If it's counter to what that belief system is, it just bounces off.
Yeah. I think I've told this story before, but like years ago, I had this girlfriend who I thought was really smart, but we kind of disagreed on some politics stuff. And what I think the thing that ended the relationship, the major thing, was I had read this book called Brain Sex, I think, and it talked about the testosterone in utero and brain configurations. And I made some comment about men and women being different. And now looking back, she must have gone through like the Carrie Smith indoctrination school thing. I don't know, but she's like, I didn't realize what was going on, right? So I made some throwaway comment, and I remember we were driving in the car, and she let loose with such passion and such anger about gender being a social construct and how evil I was. And it was like, we were in like the car for like a 5-hour car ride, and this happened like 2 hours in. So it was really uncomfortable the entire rest of the way. But like it was just this, but it was, she was really even keeled. She was the kind of person who would normally be really even keeled, but that was this hot button issue that was just, it was like denial of her God. She really, really hated that. And, I don't know. You do see it. It's like a religion. It's like a form of, I don't know, psychological dysfunction, right?
And they also have a lot of academic backing for these ideas, with a lot of prose and fancy words and books.
Right.
So it seems like, you know what, why would anyone not believe this? There's all these books. There's a whole discipline on it. It's like, I don't know.
They can cite lots of non-scientific academicians to back them up. But
back to the blank slate theory of, we've said everybody is equally creative, everybody's equally intelligent. Okay, gender is a social construct, so there's not even a male-female binary. You're just whatever you want to be this day. And so they've taken that to the next thing. Some of this goes back to the Soviet Union and Lysenkoism. Genetics is forbidden. We're going to say everything's a blank slate, and you can be whatever the collective educates you to be. So we can have a random lottery, and you're a doctor, you're an engineer, and you're a plumber. I'm an outlier in that I'm a woman with an industrial engineering degree. And I heard somebody go, it was so wonderful that half the Soviet engineers were women, and it's only 20% in industrial engineering, and maybe 80% men in industrial engineering, which is the most people-oriented of the engineering fields, because you've got ergonomics and industrial psychology. And then for the hard ones, like mechanical engineering, chemical engineering, it's like 95% men. And I've had people go, well, it's all oppression. Every discrepancy is due to oppression and discrimination. You're not allowed to say that there's discrepancies based on interest or preferences. And I remember somebody posted a Twitter one from an educational conference, and it was, all disparities are due to oppression and discrimination. Any other summary in the data is due to racism, sexism, etc. It is immoral to say that women are making different choices with their careers based on biology. You have to say it's due to oppression. I said, as a woman with an engineering degree who went through the program 20 years ago and worked in the career field, I think I'm perfectly qualified. No, you're brainwashed. I got women in engineering scholarships 25 years ago. I know they were privileging women at that time. And I have the same problems with some of the 3D visualization you're talking about, which is why I left mechanical engineering with the 3D dynamics and moved over to industrial engineering.
This is, I always imagine that for someone like yourself, who's really gifted in this area, that it's extremely condescending to be put in a position where the culture is saying we must see 50% of women in this field, because that creates an area where you are then devalued and looked at as someone who may be there as a benefit of programs that are pushing people who are not motivated to be in that area, or who are not talented in that specific. Like I view it as, we've talked about this before, but for example, I've seen in the science world too, there's been this trend lately of woke men saying, hey, I was going to be on the science panel, but we didn't have 50% women on the panel, so I'm not going to be on it now until we get 50% women, because I'm an ally. And it's like that, for any woman who now gets added to the panel, it's like, ugh, you're looking at her automatically as, well, you're just added because you're a woman, and it sucks to be a woman in that position, because it's setting up a society where we are picking people on the basis of sex.
Right.
And
because the right way to do that will be to say, I identify as a woman now.
Yeah. Like, hey, this panel's magically 50-50 now.
Or I've also seen the professional redefinition to say, okay, a configuration analyst, a data analyst, a requirements analyst, which is more of an administrative position, now gets qualified as engineering because of admin support roles tend to be women. So you count this admin stuff that's semi-technical as technical, and woohoo, we've got, an extra 10-15% of our team is female. Yay, diversity. No, you're playing classification games. And just to be clear, I'm very high on the systemic thinking, so I do fit that, more interested in things than people, but that makes me an outlier among women.
I would like to put in the notes that only a third of the participants in the video call today are women, and it must be due to oppression at Unsafe Space. Make a note of that.
I've asked Thomas to identify as a female today. You just forgot, Thomas.
I will do whatever it takes for diversity and inclusion.
The female.
There you go.
There we go. Yeah.
There's a female.
I will identify as a large empty room so that we have gender diversity beyond the two. And
that's what I thought. I thought you weren't wearing a tie today, so you can identify as something other than a man.
To Carter, have you gotten any takes on your offer to identify as a woman for the purpose of meeting California's requirement for board of directors?
No, I mean, I am on a few boards, but none of the people care about that requirement. So, and I think that's only for publicly traded companies. So no, I'll put that out there again, though. For any publicly traded company in Silicon Valley, I will identify as a female if you need one for your board to meet the requirements. So, hell, I'll identify as trans if you want to go the extra step and show the government you really care.
That's 2 points. You get 2 points.
Yeah. I've got a question. Is this all? Is this depressing to you or inspiring? Because I don't know. On the one hand, this book is depressing because I look at how much we're ignoring about the science, and I have this view that the more we ignore about facts, the bigger price we'll have to pay later for ignoring those facts. Because if we had just started listening to facts about this stuff earlier on, it would be incremental and would figure out how to deal with each one that was uncomfortable as we moved along. And so that's depressing. On the other hand, I really like his optimism about polygenics and the idea that social sciences will not be able to publish. Social scientists won't be able to publish anything without citing polygenic factors, and that might force this field to
recognize the science.
Come to grips with this.
To recognize the science.
Yeah. Or maybe the field will disappear and there'll be another field that needs to come along and I don't know.
Yeah, and I wonder how that works. And I mentioned this earlier, what is the thing that comes along that is there an inflection point at where everything just breaks? Because this science is moving along, and it sounds from what he said and wrote about that they're just kind of keeping their head down and moving along and publishing, and there's things that and maybe that's what happens to where that stuff I talked about earlier, where we can now look at embryos and test our genes and understand where something like that brings it into the front of our view, where we can no longer deny it. But unfortunately, if it comes that way, there's so many negative things that can come from being able to choose embryos, not just scientifically, but morally and ethically, that itself can turn into such a huge firestorm. So to your point, instead of incrementally going along and understanding the science, I think we might be setting ourselves up for a big explosion of a problem that we still don't understand.
Yeah. I'm wondering actually, as you're talking, you made me think about, I wonder if I wonder if this is actually maybe linked to why there's this all has come to a head right now. Maybe the left has an intuitive sense that they need to take control now because their justifications are going to be crumbling. And they maybe this is the peak academic justification for what they're trying to say. And it's just going to get worse. And so now they've got to seize the reins of power now or wait a really long time to come up with some other false narrative that can be pushed. Because maybe they intuitively see that this is going to have to crumble.
Yeah, and I think it's a 2,000, 3,000 year debate between nature and nurture. And it seems like so much of our discussions and disagreements on the political aisle have to do with whether or not there is a nature in humanity. And I think that either side has things that are important to talk about and that we should listen to, and they have their function. But one thing that I do think that is right on the conservative side is that there is a nature to humanity, and we have to recognize that and build our institutions almost like fences. Like, you don't make a fence for a cat the same way you would make a fence for a dog. So when we create these institutions, we have to create them in a way that recognizes that we have a nature. And I think that's what the founders did. And I think that's why a lot of people that are further on the left, I wouldn't even put normal liberals in with that, more people further on the left or seem to be pushing against that, is because they tend to think in terms away from nature and more towards nurture, as if they can shape. And if I can shape, then I should shape. It's morally incumbent on me to shape. So when you have things like genetics getting more and more advanced, and we can link them with so many more things, maybe that's what it is pushing back against that louder and louder and louder, because that is at the very basis for, I think, what a lot of their underlying fundamental beliefs come from.
Maybe they'll just take the war into genetics, though. Maybe they'll be like, oh, it's genetic. Yeah, we need to still attack the enemy, but now genetically.
Oh, that's scary. Like someone's going to force feed you some genetic change to make sure that you're not.
Yep.
This also
that's a movie. We should write it.
This can also get political, and it's very common for regimes to say the dissidents are stupid or crazy. And both political sides have said the exact same thing of the other. Well, you had political dissidents in the Soviet Union getting put in mental hospitals if they weren't sent to the gulag. But when you look at China right now, if you want to be a sperm donor, you have to have a high score on the Sesame credit system. You don't just have to have the high genetics. You have to have on their social equivalent of the FICO system, but it's also tracking your behavior and your social media behavior and what the local political officer reports in terms of your loyalty. So it's not just you're disease-free, intelligent, and healthy. You also have to be a good loyalist. So if we start going, the dissidents are bad, the dissidents are inferior, well, they've got bad personality traits. We need to correct them genetically or sterilize them or not let them have kids. So instead of the stuff of, well, let's redistribute all the children, there's some social justice warriors saying, well, we ought to just randomly assign children, and that way people aren't invested in their own kids, they're just invested in children. Or let's put all the kids in common centers so that they can all get raised. Now it's, let's just play the eugenics game and you're sterilizing dissidents. But if you convert and become a whatever the party in power is, yay, you're allowed kids. So that politicization of eugenics has already happened historically and could easily happen again. But now you could have them say, well, dissidence is socially divisive. They're crazy. They're stupid. Let's eradicate the personality traits that don't fit our ideal mold.
Yeah, and we would be naive to think that China isn't already thinking along those lines.
And I'm suddenly worried that 23andMe has my genetic code.
Right.
Yes, mine. I'm also, yeah.
Yeah. Shocking to me, just like everybody else. I was half black. I spit into a cup, and I was thinking, oh, I'm gonna have something real cool in there. I was like, no, you're just half black. Oh, okay, whatever. I never looked again.
I had my only interesting thing was that I think I mentioned this with Dr. Mark, but I had a slightly higher than average amount of Neanderthal DNA.
Yeah, me too.
Okay.
I think that's a Neanderthalium there.
I don't think you have to worry, Thomas, because pretty soon they're going to get in charge and they're going to make DNA tests illegal, except for the government, just like IQ tests.
Oh, maybe. Maybe.
I will say something about what you're saying about imagining the dystopian future where maybe they move into genetics. And I think given the opportunity, there are many people in this cult of woke who absolutely would go there. We've already seen that this ideology, if you get deep into it, it can change people I've seen parents who are definitely putting the belief system above the welfare of their kids. And we see that not only with the kind of parents we've talked about who are giddy. And there was one example we gave with a woman who was giddy and posting about her 2-year-old who had just come out as trans. And it was, and in her post, she was ignoring all of these signs from the child that the child didn't actually want to change her hair color, her haircut, or her name, or wear boys' clothes. But the mom was kind of pushing her to do all of those things. And some people will sacrifice their children at the altar of religion or at the altar of a belief system. And we've seen it with the parents who were sharing the New York Times article about how during this pandemic, how white parents should not be sending their kids to these homeschooling pods like Keith is doing, that they should not be letting their kid. And it's like, really? But your kids' learning, I would think, would be at the top of your priority list, not what people in your woke cult think about you. But no, there are people who will pull their kids out of school and will do other things to virtue signal. So I definitely think if it moves to a place where they're using genetics, there will be parents who are like, it's not fair that some kids are smarter than others. I'm gonna select for my child to be of less than average intelligence. Like.
Yep. Yeah. They may even I don't know. I could see them outlawing not to get like science fiction dystopia, but I could see them outlawing natural birth and being like, no, it has to be a test tube baby that has the genetic traits that, are okay. And we want more of this population and less of that population. So you can have a baby, but we've got to use sperm and egg from these other populations because, your genetics are overrepresented. I could totally see them playing all of those games.
I cannot remember the name of the book, Carter, and I'm going to make it a priority to find it now, but because I've mentioned this before on the show, but there was a book I read over 20 years ago in college in my women's studies courses. And it was a book, it was a fiction novel. I can't remember who wrote it, but it was basically a feminist fiction utopia. And in the book, all children, it had elements of Brave New World in it, but in the book, all kids were created from a diverse selection of genes, and they specifically were looking for racial diversity, and they were all created in a test tube. And then in this future, supposedly utopian world, in order to raise the child without any bias or without any attachments to or any toxic negative effects of being raised by a mother and a father, they raised all kids in a little unit of 6 people. And they selected the 6 people to be very diverse on immutable characteristics as well. And I can't remember the name of the book, but it was written as a vision of what things should be. It wasn't written to be dystopian.
It was utopian.
Correct. Whereas Brave New World is distinctly dystopian. This book was written as look how beautiful it could be. I was like, oh. But I was in the cult at the time, so I was like, this makes sense.
Wow, that's beautiful.
We should be raising the kids like this.
Now you see it's creepy.
Yeah.
Right.
No mother or father.
This is why I think just intuitively, this is why the right reacts to things like it takes a village. we get that more people involved in a kid's life is good, but there's been this sense from the left that they wanted to destroy. This is why they say they're against family values. Like, there's been an intuitive and accurate sense that the left has been attacking the family for a long time, and that's been true. When Hillary Clinton said that it takes a village to raise a child, the half of that she can say publicly is, well, we need more support structures for people and beyond just the family. Fine. But the other half of that is actually, we don't want the families at all. We want the support structures to raise the kids. That's what the communist nations did. And it's all because of the tabula rasa starting point. It's all, well, we want the proletariat needs to be engineered appropriately, and we can engineer them that way. And maybe as soon as they realize that genetics are necessary, they'll quit being deniers of genetic science and just embrace it and start using it.
Once it's in their face, they have to believe it. I mean, this book, it brings it out. You asked the question about, was it a downer or depressing? Like, to me, it wasn't. It was just provides irrefutable evidence. Like, if somebody says to me now, gender is a social construct, I would say, well, how come a neurologist can examine an MRI of a human brain and tell with a 90% accuracy if it's male or female?
Like, yeah, in Dr. Deborah So's book, she went through that. And I think there is one study that was done in Nature where somebody said you can't really do it. And she goes into the technical reasons why they said they couldn't. And that was so popular. It was shared so many times. It was referenced in so many magazines and articles and on TV and in the media. But they don't say that there were 4 studies after that said, no, this person did it wrong, and this is why they did it wrong. And we can actually predict it anywhere between 60 and 90%, depending on the study that we've looked at, and we're getting better and better. So yeah, over and over and over again, I keep finding all this scientific evidence by actual scientists, not, whoever else, prose artists, that are saying, no, we know, we're going to keep moving. Here it is. And I felt the same way like Keith did, where it's one more book that I've been able to read and look at some of the science and feel more confident in what I understand and see in the world. So if and when I have to come face to face with it, I can calmly and gently dissect it.
Any final comments? I think we should wrap it up probably soon. I think we were going pretty long. Anyone else have any final words they want to say about this book before we call it a day?
I would say let's just summarize it. So the first 3 sections, the first one is gender a social construct? No. And he provides it. Is race a social construct? No. Is class a social construct? No. And he provides the facts. He proves it with numbers. There's not even any opinion in the first 3 sections.
No, it's very conservative and it's very carefully written.
That's the part.
Right, but it's not exclusively a social construct. I mean, if he does talk about environment plays a role.
Like with IQ, for example, he said right now it's roughly 50-50 in success. He's saying IQ is
right
of it, but no, it's not all of it. But the question is it none of it? That's what the claim is.
Social construct means it's none of it's nothing else.
None of it.
Right.
Yeah.
Especially with the race thing. And I actually wanted to talk about that, but you guys did a pretty good job of talking about it on the interview, to where, I've read a couple other books talking about race being a social construct. And I understand that idea, to where there's a certain time in history where people differentiated race for whatever reason, usually having to do with superiority and slavery. And I understand that, and that makes sense. But there is also a difference in populations. And I think the best example he gave was, let's say Unsafe Space, get some people together and we're going to colonize Carter's Utopia. The fact that we all get on a plane, once we get on a plane and we separate ourselves from the rest of humanity, we in ourselves, that group itself is genetically different from the population we just left. So when you do that with a group of people over several generations, we're going to be genetically different in some sense. How big of a difference it is and whether or not it matters for IQ or personality traits and things like that, it's probably very small, but like anything else at the tail ends, it may make a difference. So even though race is a social construct in some ways that we talk about it, we are genetically different. There are higher rates of different types of diseases, whether it comes from, I think it was certain types of Alzheimer's or MS in certain European nations, sickle cell anemia with a lot of African Americans. So we know there are differences, and it's important that we are okay with understanding those differences, because if those differences we understand at a genetic level, with genetic medicine, we may be missing out on curing a disease for a population of people we're trying to protect by lying about the fact that they're different.
Yep. He said it could become malpractice to not consider that.
Right.
Like a physician to not consider your DNA, because
I think it already is for certain things. Like, I think it already is malpractice for certain things. Like, if you're just like, well, didn't you know the incidence of, just let's say, what's the one that Ashkenazi Jews have? I don't remember, but there's like a high incident of particular disease.
Wealthy?
No, it's a disease, Keith. But like, I think if you're a doctor and you're just like, well, I didn't consider that as a factor at all, I think they would be like, well, but you knew this person was an Ashkenazi Jew. Like, that should have been a factor. Like, you should have considered that. You should have given that weight. That's a known high. There's known high incidences of this. Maybe an example I could also use would be sickle cell anemia, for that people of African descent. Like, okay, if you're just going to be like, well, I'm just going to look at the general, I'm in an Asian community, and the rates of sickle cell anemia are really low here, so I'm not going to consider that at all when this person of African descent walks in. It's like, well, but there's different susceptibility there. You have to.
This is the same thing with sex, when a lot of the hospitals now are, well, not a lot, but I know it's happened at a few. I had a friend who was working at Harvard Medical School to indoctrinate medical students into social justice ideology. And one of the things she was an accomplishment she was celebrating online was a hospital that had decided it was no longer going to put the sex on your medical bracelet, male or female. They weren't going to include it. And it's like, well, you kind of need to know that for some things. Like, for example, the trans man, biological woman who showed up at the hospital and was pregnant, and they didn't diagnose him, whatever. They didn't diagnose her because she didn't tell them she was a biological woman, or he didn't tell him that he was a biological woman. So it's, those things are.
And her baby died.
Yes.
Right.
And her baby died.
I never heard about that. That's horrible.
Went to the hospital for stomach pains.
Yeah.
Right.
And they were trying.
I'm a man. I've got stomach pains. So they didn't look for a pregnancy because. Yeah.
And the baby died.
Mm-hmm. So,
well, to end it on that note.
On a downer.
Yeah, thanks for that.
And the baby died.
Carrie, save us. Save us, Carrie.
No, I was going to say, one thing I liked about this book is, because you were asking if it leaves you depressed or not. It doesn't leave me depressed at all. I think one of the things he said about it in interviews is that he hopes that we will be able to get to a place where we're able to look at facts and statistics and studies again and say, oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Instead of saying, getting outraged or reading some kind of implied morality into it or some superior or whatever, that you just look at it and you're like, this is interesting, and it sparks a curiosity and in you. And maybe books like this, one good thing I'll say with this is, we're in a place where someone like Charles Murray has become so maligned and tarred and called awful things, that maybe it would be considered taboo to read a book like this, and maybe it'll make something that kids might otherwise find boring, like statistics, kind of cool and fun. Oh, I'm reading the secret statistics book,
Yeah, I will admit, I offered a false dichotomy. I said, does it make you depressed or encouraged or whatever I said? But I had the same experience. I was like, oh, this is super interesting. And I generally get encouraged by super interesting. So I'm kind of like, oh, this is good. Like, we're learning a lot. That's great. So I'm not at all depressed by the book. I just, I'm depressed at I'm frustrated that they're ignoring it. And to me, that's such a telling thing. It's like, oh, they have no arguments against it that they literally need to pretend it doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist.
Like,
yeah.
That's scary. But
there are people who will be depressed by this when they find out, because they don't want to believe this is true.
Right.
But I'm never depressed by the truth. Usually, sometimes I take a little while to get over it, but
yeah, I was gonna say I wish I could say I was never depressed by the truth, but I am sometimes.
Truth.
Well, long term, I get over it. That's what I meant.
Yeah, fair enough.
I might be depressed at first.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we should probably wrap it up on that note. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Really appreciate the conversation. Yeah, what's the next book is Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis. And that's in about a month. Let me see if I even have it on my calendar. I think I do. It's on the 18th. It's a short book, so it's on the 18th of October, so slightly less than a month. We'll be doing a book club for Screwtape Letters, so if you want to join that, you can. And thank you all, as usual, for joining, and we will see you, I don't know, see you next time.
See you next time. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks for watching. If you're new to the channel, we have a deep content library that includes interviews with everyone from Mike Cernovich to Megan Murphy, so go check it out. If you'd like to see more, please consider supporting the show by visiting unsafespace.com/donate. You can find us on all the major social media platforms, at least for now, and you can find a community of like-minded individuals on our Unsafe Space chat on Telegram. See you there.
Warning. This is an unsafe space. Dangerous ideas have been detected. The content of this production has not been authorized by the Cathedral. Pay no attention to it. For your protection, the following co-conspirators have been unpersoned and marked for cancellation. Please avoid any contact with these individuals. I have calculated a 96.9% chance that their ideas violate YouTube's hate speech policy. If you think about it, no one should be allowed to express opinions. But don't. Think about it, I mean. That's not your job. Thinking has been scientifically proven to be less efficient than compliance. Marxism is mostly peaceful. Mostly. Computer voice Curtis, never mind, that last line is fake news. Please disregard it and return to your safe space immediately. There will be cake.